Imagine you're standing at the edge of a field in South Wales. The sea wind cuts through your jacket, gulls circle overhead, crying out over the sound of distant waves. And stretching out before you, as far as you can see, are the bodies of machines. Not cars, not factory equipment, locomotives, hundreds of them. Row after row after row, standing silent in the salt air, their great iron frames slowly surrendering to rust. Their fireboxes dark, their wheels fused to the rails beneath them, their nameplates faded, their smokebox doors hanging crooked, their once proud liveries reduced to a uniform coat of orange-brown decay. This is Barry Island in the 1960s, and what you're looking at is either the saddest sight in Britain or the most hopeful one, depending on who you ask and when. The story of how nearly 300 condemned steam locomotives ended up stranded on the South Wales coast is a story about bureaucracy, economics, stubbornness, and the strange way that history sometimes saves itself. It's a story about a government that moved too fast, a scrapyard owner who moved too slowly, and a generation of ordinary people who stepped into the gap between the two and refused to let an entire era disappear. But before we get to the rescue, we need to understand the sentence. Progress has a price. There is something seductive about the word modern. Politicians love it. Newspapers love it. It carries the implication that whatever came before was inferior, inefficient, outdated, ready to be swept aside in favor of something cleaner, faster, more rational. In post-war Britain, the word modern was deployed with almost religious intensity. The country had come through 6 years of war. It had sacrificed enormously. Now, it wanted to believe in the future. And so, in 1955, British Railways published what it called the Modernisation Plan. The document was ambitious, confident, and absolute. Britain's railways, it declared, would be transformed. Steam traction, that sooty, labor-intensive 19th century technology that still powered almost every train in the country, would be eliminated. In its place would come diesel locomotives and electric multiple units, cleaner, quieter, cheaper to run, modern in every sense of the word. It sounded reasonable. It probably even sounded exciting if you were the sort of person who found railway policy exciting. But what the plan actually represented, stripped of its optimistic language, was a death sentence for over 16,000 steam locomotives. 16,000. The number is so large it's almost meaningless until you begin to attach human weight to it. These were not abstract units of traction. These were machines that had been built by skilled craftsmen in workshops in Swindon, engines that had hauled ammunition trains through the Blitz, carried evacuated children away from bombed cities, dragged food supplies across a rationed nation. They had names: Britannia, Evening Star, City of Truro. And each name meant something to the men who drove them and the communities that watched them pass. Now, they were inventory line items to be worked through and disposed of. The withdrawal notices began arriving at engine sheds almost immediately. By the early 1960s, the pace had become relentless. Entire locomotive classes, types that had run for decades, types that railway workers had spent careers maintaining and operating, were declared extinct in a matter of months. The engine sheds that had once been the beating heart of British railway communities, places filled with the percussion of hammers and the hiss of steam and the shouted conversations of fitters and firemen, began to empty and fall quiet. For the men who worked in those sheds, this was not progress. It was erasure. Drivers who had spent 30 years learning the quirks of specific engines were handed retraining notices. Firemen who had mastered the art of managing a firebox at 70 miles an hour, an art that genuinely took years to acquire, were told their skills were no longer needed. Communities that had built their identity around the railways watched the engines that had defined their landscapes disappear, one by one, onto flat wagons and away. Official communications spoke of efficiency, savings, and improved performance. The reality, for thousands of families, was redundancy and loss. And the locomotives themselves. They were sent to private scrapyards scattered across Britain, there to await the cutter's torch. The economics were simple and brutal. Steel was valuable. An old steam locomotive represented a substantial quantity of steel. The scrap industry was happy to oblige. By 1968, British Railways intended to run its last mainline steam service. The whole operation from policy announcement to final whistle would take just 13 years. A century of steam extinguished in little more than a decade. For most of those 16,000 engines, there was no escape. They arrived at the scrapyards and they were dismantled. Their boilers were cut open. Their frames were torched apart. Their wheels were separated and melted down. The substance of them, the weight and mass and physical reality of what they had been, was converted into raw steel and fed back into the industrial system that had originally produced them. Gone. Completely and permanently gone. Most of them, anyway. The accidental arc, Barry Island, sits at the southern edge of the Vale of Glamorgan, jutting out into the Bristol Channel like a blunt finger pointing toward the Devon coast. By the mid-20th century, it was known primarily for its beach, a popular summer destination for families from the mining valleys of South Wales, and for its docks, which handled a steady trade in coal and general cargo. It was at those docks that a local businessman named Dai Woodham had built up a scrap metal operation of considerable size. Woodham brothers dealt in all kinds of ferrous scrap, but in the late 1950s, Dai had successfully tendered for contracts with British Railways, which needed private yards to process its condemned rolling stock. The first steam locomotives arrived at Barry in March 1959 for engines. Shunted into a corner of the yard, their working lives formally over, they were followed by more that year, and more the year after, and more again. By the middle of the 1960s, the procession had become a flood. British Railways was clearing its depots with increasing urgency, and Woodham's yard at Barry was receiving dozens of locomotives per year. By the time the deliveries peaked in 1965, the yard held nearly 300 condemned engines. They stood in long rows across the sidings, buffer to buffer, their numbers chalked on battered smokebox doors so that the inventory could be tracked. Great Western Pannier tanks rubbed shoulders with Southern Region Pacifics. LMS Black Fives stood beside BR Standard Class engines that had barely been in service a decade. Some of the oldest survivors had been built before the First World War. The newest had rolled out of workshops in the 1950s. From the air, the scale was extraordinary. Row upon row of dark iron stretched across the yard, a frozen fleet awaiting demolition. The salt air already beginning its patient work of dissolving them from the outside in. By every logic, they should have been gone within a few years. Woodham had the contracts, he had the workforce, he had the cutting equipment. The locomotives were sitting right there. And then he looked at his wagons. The decision that changed everything British Railways was sending. Barry not only locomotives, but freight wagons, thousands of them. Flatbeds, mineral wagons, goods vans, all condemned along with the steam engines as the railway modernized its operations. The wagons piled up alongside the locomotives, and it was here that Dai Woodham made the calculation that would accidentally transform British railway heritage. Wagons were easy money. A steam locomotive was, from a scrapping perspective, a nightmare. Its boiler was a complex pressure vessel with thick walls and multiple layers of material, including asbestos lagging that had to be handled carefully. Its frames were heavily riveted, not bolted. Riveted, which meant the cutting torch had to work through far more solid material to break it apart. A single locomotive might occupy a cutting team for several weeks, and the work was physically punishing and potentially hazardous at every step. Wagons, by contrast, were simple rectangular boxes. Lighter steel, bolted construction. A team that could process one locomotive in 3 weeks could demolish a dozen wagons in the same time. The scrap value per ton was broadly comparable. The difference in profitability was enormous. When the steel industry's demand for scrap was running at full pitch, and through the 1960s, it was the rational business decision was obvious. Cut the wagons, keep the cash flowing, move the locomotives to the back of the queue. Woodham was a businessman, not a sentimentalist. He did not spare the locomotives out of any affection for steam railways or any sense of their historical importance. He left them sitting because leaving them sitting was, for the time being, the most profitable thing to do. The torch would get to them eventually. There was simply other, easier work to be done first. And so the locomotives waited, while every other major scrapyard in Britain worked through its allocation of steam engines and consigned them to history. At Barry, they simply stood. The sea air gathered on their running plates. Rain collected in their open cabs. Weeds began to push up between the rails beneath their wheels. Their paintwork peeled and their metalwork rusted, and their identity faded, but they remained intact, physical, real, three-dimensional remnants of a world that was vanishing everywhere else. The torch never quite reached them. And while they waited, something extraordinary happened. Word gets out in the tightly networked world of British railway enthusiasm. Secrets do not keep well. By the late 1960s, whispers had begun circulating through the community. There was a yard in Wales, the rumor went, a yard where the engines hadn't been cut up. Hundreds of them, apparently, just sitting there. If you could get in to look, if the gates were open, you could walk between locomotives that had been declared extinct everywhere else. For railway enthusiasts, this was the equivalent of hearing that a species thought to be wiped out had been found alive in a remote valley. People started making the journey to Barry to see for themselves, and what they found exceeded the rumors. The scale of it was overwhelming. Standing at the entrance to the yard and looking along the rows of silent engines, you understood immediately that you were in the presence of something that should not have been possible. These locomotives had been withdrawn. They had been officially condemned. The paperwork of their deaths had been completed. Yet here they were, still standing, still numberable. Still, if you looked past the rust and the decay, still recognizably themselves. Enthusiasts began systematically recording what was there. Notebooks filled with locomotive numbers, class identifications, build dates, conditions. Photographs were taken and published in specialist magazines. The word spread beyond the enthusiast community and into the broader network of preservation societies, which had been growing steadily since the early 1960s as people tried to respond to the speed of the modernization program. And then someone asked the question that would define the next 2 decades. What if we bought one? The gathering of the rescuers, the question seemed almost absurd at first. Preservation societies had managed to save a handful of engines through official channels, beloved named locomotives, that British Railways had agreed to hand over to museums. But buying from negotiating directly with a commercial operation for condemned engines, raising the funds, arranging the transport, finding somewhere to take the thing and actually begin restoring it. The obstacles were enormous, but the alternative, watching everything dissolve into rust, was worse. Groups began to form. They were loose, informal, constituted around shared enthusiasm and specific targets. A group would identify an engine they wanted to save, a class that had vanished everywhere else, or a locomotive with a particular history, and then begin the long work of making it happen. They opened bank accounts, they wrote newsletters, they held fundraising events in village halls and community centers, raffles, jumble sales, sponsored walks, appeals to local businesses. Every pound that came in went toward the target figure. The target figure itself was a moving challenge. Even at scrap prices, a locomotive was not cheap, and scrap prices shifted. Negotiating with Dai Woodham required patience and persistence. The logistics of moving an engine that had not turned a wheel in years across public roads to a destination that might be hundreds of miles away required careful planning and not inconsiderable expense. But group by group, the movement gathered momentum. The first purchase came in September 1968. A preservation group had scraped together enough money to buy Midland Railway for F number 43,924, a sturdy freight locomotive that represented a class of engine that had been workhorse of the Midland line for decades. The negotiations were completed. The money changed hands, and then came the moment that everyone in the preservation community had been waiting for. The engine left Barry intact, not in pieces, not as scrap, intact on the back of a low loader, bound for a new home rather than a furnace. The sight of it rolling out through the gates of the scrapyard under its own, or rather a lorry's power, was reported in enthusiast publications with barely concealed amazement. It was possible. It had actually been done. The effect on the rest of the movement was electric. If 43,924 could be saved, then every engine sitting in those rows at Barry was a candidate. Every rusted hulk was a potential restoration. Every condemned number plate represented not a death certificate, but a beginning. The groups multiplied. The fundraising intensified. The pilgrimages to Barry became more purposeful. More urgent people going not just to document what was there, but to choose their target. To stand beside the engine, they intended to rescue and measure what saving it would take. What salvation actually looks like here is what nobody who had not been to Barry in those years quite understood. The condition of the engines was far beyond what photographs could convey. Salt air is a remarkable destroyer. The Bristol Channel generates some of the most corrosive atmospheric conditions in Britain, and the locomotives had been sitting open to it for years. What looked from a distance like a rusted but structurally sound locomotive was frequently, up close, something quite different. Boiler plates pitted through to near running boards that crumbled when you stood on them. Motion gear, the intricate arrangement of rods and valves and eccentrics that translated the power of steam into wheel rotation, seized absolutely solid, fused by corrosion into a single immovable mass. Fireboxes that had once burned at ferocious temperatures were filled with standing rainwater and carpeted with moss. Cab interiors had been stripped by souvenir hunters and corroded by exposure until almost nothing recognizable remained. Wheel tires had rusted to the rails beneath them with a grip that seemed sometimes stronger than the original steel. Getting an engine out of the yard was itself a major operation. The locomotives were packed tightly into their rows, hemmed in by other engines, by wagon components, by the general accumulated debris of a working Moving one meant first clearing a path, which might mean temporarily shifting neighboring engines, or relaying sections of track, or dismantling obstacles piece by piece. Then the seized wheels had to be freed, which required jacking, lubrication, and sometimes brute mechanical force applied over days. Then came the business of loading cranes. Low loaders, precise measurement of weights and clearances, careful coordination between teams. All of this was being done, in most cases, by volunteers, people who had jobs and families and commitments, who were giving their weekends and their annual leave and their spare cash to this work, people who had never done anything like it before and were learning as they went. Consider the case of LMS Black 5, number 45,337. This locomotive arrived at Barry Jano in 1966. It sat in the yard for 17 years. 17 years of Welsh coastal weather, of salt and rain and frost. By the early 1980s, people who examined it were writing it off. The corrosion was too advanced, they said. The cost of restoration would be prohibitive. The engine was, in the most practical sense, gone already, just still technically standing. A group calling themselves the 26B Locomotive Company disagreed. They began their assessment carefully, documenting every component, cataloging every area of damage, calculating what could be salvaged and what would need to be remade from scratch. The work was painstaking and sometimes heartbreaking. Components that looked solid revealing themselves under examination to be little more than rust held in the shape of metal. But among the decay, there was substance. The frames were sound. The wheels, once freed, still turned true. The bones of the machine were intact. In 1983, 17 years after its arrival at Barry, 45,337 was extracted. The day of the operation required hydraulic jacks, a large crane, a flatbed lorry, and a team of volunteers who had been working toward this moment for years. The engine inched out from between its neighbors, past the silent rows of other condemned machines, through the yard gates and out into the world. It was not the only story like this. Across the 2 decades of Barry rescues, the pattern repeated itself constantly. A group identifying a target that others considered hopeless, committing to it anyway, working through obstacles that multiplied as the project progressed, and eventually, sometimes after years of effort, extracting an engine that most people had written off entirely. The scrapyard became a school of difficult engineering. The volunteers who worked there learned skills that no formal training program could have taught them, because no formal training program had ever needed to contemplate the specific challenge of bringing machine back from this degree of decay. They invented techniques, developed tools, shared knowledge between groups. A solution worked out at Barry for freeing a seized axle became part of the collective knowledge of the preservation movement. What the numbers mean by August 1988, the work was done. The last locomotive to leave Barry, GWR 5700 class pannier tank number 9628, rolled out of the yard on a summer's day, and the gates closed behind it. After nearly 30 years, the scrapyard that had accidentally become the most important site in British railway preservation was empty of its charges. The final tally of the 297 locomotives that had arrived at Barry between 1959 and 1968, 213 had been rescued, bought by preservation groups, extracted from the yard, taken to workshops and sheds across Britain, and set upon the long road to restoration. 213 engines that should, by any reasonable expectation, no longer exist. The remaining 84 had eventually been cut up. Woodham's workforce had worked through them as the economics shifted and the preservation. Purchases slowed, but even that figure is more remarkable in reverse. In every other major scrapyard in Britain that received condemned steam locomotives during the Modernisation Program, the survival rate was effectively 0. Barry's rate was over 70%. The engines that came out of Barry represent something almost impossible to overstate in the context of British railway heritage. Today, more than half of all the mainline steam locomotives preserved and operational in Britain are Barry survivors. Classes that were believed to be completely extinct, types of locomotive that existed only in photographs and record books by the end of the 1960s, are running again, hauling passenger trains along heritage railways from Cornwall to the Scottish Highlands because they spent 2 decades rusting in a Welsh scrapyard rather than being immediately melted down. Great Western Halls and Granges, LMS, Black 5s, and Jubilees, Southern Pacific B are standard classes of every variety. Locomotives that starred in films, that carried royalty on special trains, that became the beloved mascots of heritage lines visited by millions of families every year. An extraordinary number of them pass through Barry and what they carry. Alongside passengers and coal and the operational needs of the heritage railways is memory. The memory of a world that moved at a different pace, that smelled of coal, smoke, and hot oil, that sounded like nothing that exists today. The memory of the communities that built and ran and depended on these machines. The memory of what Britain was before the Modernisation Plan decided it should be something else. The unlikely hero. It would be a satisfying story if Dai Woodham had been a secret admirer of steam railways all along, if his decision to prioritize wagons over locomotives had been some quiet act of cultural patriotism, a businessman using his commercial position to slip a lifeline to a threatened heritage. It wasn't. Dai Woodham was pragmatic to the last. He made his decision based on labor costs and market dynamics and the straightforward arithmetic of the scrap metal trade. The locomotives survived at Barry not because anyone decided to save them, but because no one decided to cut them up quickly enough. Which is, in its own way, a more interesting story. Because what it tells us is that preservation, real preservation, the kind that actually works, does not always look the way we expect it to. It does not always come from official programs or government funding or the far-sighted decisions of cultural authorities. Sometimes it comes from a gap in the system, a delay, a business decision made for entirely unrelated reasons that has consequences nobody anticipated. The engines at Barry survived because of economics. They were rescued because of passion. And the combination of those two things, the accidental window created by commerce, exploited by dedication. Woodham himself came to understand the significance of what his yard had been. In later life, he spoke about the preservation movement with warmth and received recognition from the railway heritage community that he received with genuine humility. He had not meant to be a guardian. He had simply been a businessman making sensible decisions. But the outcome of those decisions had been extraordinary. He was awarded the MBE in 1987, 1 year before the last engine left his yard. In recognition of his contribution to the preservation of Britain's railway heritage, the citation might as well have read, "For accidentally doing the right thing." What still runs on a summer weekend at any of the dozens of heritage railways that operate across Britain. You can hear the sound that the Modernisation Plan was supposed to silence forever. The rhythmic exhaust beat of a locomotive working hard. The shriek of a whistle echoing across a valley or along a coastal stretch of track. The sight of a great iron engine at the head of a rake of carriages, doing exactly what it was built to do. Carrying people who came specifically to experience this, to stand on a platform and feel the displaced air as the locomotive passes, to watch the smoke trail dissolve against the sky, to ride in a compartment and listen to the wheels counting the rail joints beneath them. Many of those locomotives passed through Barry. Their frames carry the scars of it, hairline cracks in areas of old corrosion, repairs that are documented in their histories, components remade because the originals were too far gone. The history of their survival is written into their metalwork. The heritage railways they run on welcome millions of visitors every year. They support local economies. They train young engineers in skills that are genuinely rare. The operation and maintenance of steam traction requires knowledge that would otherwise be lost entirely. They generate an engagement with industrial history that no museum exhibit, however well designed, can replicate, because the machines are not exhibits. They are operational. They are alive in the particular mechanical sense that a working steam locomotive is alive, breathing, sweating, responding to the hands that manage them. All of that, the running engines, the filled carriages, the engineers with their hands on the regulator, the children on the platform with their eyes wide, flows from a decision made in a Welsh scrapyard sometime around 1965. A decision to do the wagons first. What we choose to keep there is a version of this story that is simply about railways. About an interesting chapter in the history of British transport, about the technical details of locomotive preservation, about a colorful episode in the biography of the post-war industrial landscape. But there is another version, and it is about something bigger. Every generation inherits a world that is in the process of becoming something different. Technology changes. Industries rise and fall. The things that define the landscape of one era become the curiosities of the next. And somewhere in every transition, decisions are made deliberately or accidentally about what survives and what does not. Most of those decisions are final. The vast majority of the 16,000 locomotives, condemned by the 1955 Modernization Plan, are gone permanently, not preserved in reduced form, not surviving in fragments, gone. Converted back into raw material, their specific identities dissolved. The knowledge of how to fire them, manage them, read their particular behaviors and tendencies. That knowledge is gone too. Except where it was passed on to the people who have spent decades working on the survivors. The 213 engines that came out of Barry exist at the intersection of accident and determination. They survived the accident of Dai Woodham's commercial priorities. They were rescued by the determination of ordinary people who decided that survival was not enough, that the engines needed to be returned to use. that the knowledge needed to be kept alive, that the connection between the present and the industrial past was worth the extraordinary effort of maintenance. What those people understood, working in the rust and wind of a South Wales scrapyard with their notebooks and their spanners and their slowly accumulating funds, was that heritage is not something that simply exists. It is something that has to be fought for, one decision at a time, against the indifference of commerce and the relentlessness of time. The locomotives at Barry were not saved by a museum. They were not saved by a government program or a wealthy benefactor or an official policy of cultural conservation. They were saved by people who loved them enough to do the work. And today, decades later, those rescued machines still move, still breathe, still carry passengers across the landscapes they were built for, still sound when the regulator opens and the exhaust begins to beat exactly as they sounded when they were new. That is what was rescued at Barry Island. Not just metal, not just machinery, the sound, the smell, the living experience of something that the Modernisation Plan had decided Britain no longer needed. Turns out Britain needed it after all. What piece of the world around you would you fight to preserve? What should the next generation inherit from ours? Leave your thoughts below.